away from this. And so look with me to 1 Samuel 15, if you would, please. And 1 Samuel 15. And while you're turning there by way of introduction to the message, by the way, the title of the message is this morning, The Believer's Remaining Sin and How to Deal with It. The believer's remaining sin and how to deal with it. You know, in Psalms 38, it's filled with the feelings of a guilty conscience. In verse 2, the psalmist says, and you don't have to turn there, you can just listen if you don't mind. Psalms 38, 2 through 6, For thine arrows stick fast in me, and thy hand presseth me sore. There is no soundness in my flesh because of thine anger. Neither is there any rest in my bones because of my sin. For mine iniquities are gone over mine head. As a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and are corrupt because of my foolishness. I am troubled. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. Well, David was in a mess, wasn't he, because of sin. Those feelings of a guilty conscience, and that's quite a contrast to what the Apostle Paul says over in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12, Paul's dealing in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12 with a conscience, with a clear conscience, with a good conscience. And Paul is very much at the end of the spectrum from the psalmist in Psalms 38 that we just read. So let me just read you 1 Corinthians 1:12. For our rejoicing is this, the testimony of our conscience, that in simplicity and godly sincerity, not with fleshly wisdom, but by the grace of God, we have had our conversation in the world and more abundantly to youward. Paul was enjoying a clear conscience, a good conscience. The psalmist was feeling the pain of an accusing conscience. So just track with me here. As you know, the conscience is the soul's warning system. By that I mean the conscience produces guilt, shame, anxiety, restlessness, fear, doubt, physical illness, and even pain and other depressing experiences. When the highest known standard of moral conduct is violated, all those things occur in the mind of a believer. The conscience is given to us as a gift from God to warn us about what devastates the soul. And the Apostle Paul was living a holy life, and so he had a clear and a non-accusing conscience, because Paul dedicated himself to live a godly life. He wasn't perfect, but he was victorious over the sin that was in his life. He died daily. I don't think Paul just let anything go. He fought the good fight every day of his life. No Christian can give testimony, honest testimony, to the fact that when he became a Christian, sin was erased. Excuse me. We know there are denominations that teach that, but it's not so. My friends, the tendency to sin is still in our lives. Are you able to track with me on this? Even though we're saved, we still sin, and even worse, we still get pleasure from our sin. We still struggle, with sinful habits. Not just sinful, isolated acts. And sometimes we fall into shameful, disgraceful sins. Our thoughts and our words are not always what they ought to be. Our time is often wasted on foolish and worldly pursuits. Our mind and our affections are often set on things that will pass away. Our hearts often grow cold to things holy and cold in reaching out to those around us. And we might ask the question, why is this so? Why is this so? Well, in Romans chapter 6, we might come to the conclusion that everything should just be different. Romans 6:14 says, for sin shall not have dominion over you. Remember, we talked about this a few months ago, I believe. For ye are not under the law, but under grace. Then notice with me, you don't have to, you can just follow along. In verse 17 of Romans 6, but God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Verse 18, being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. So if sin doesn't have dominion over us, if we are truly no longer the slaves of sin, why can't we live a pure life and enjoy a clear conscience? Why then does this battle just go on and on and on and on? Well, the answer is there is yet remaining sin within us. Now, I know you know this, but we all need to be reminded. We have been saved from the penalty of sin, and that Christ took the penalty Himself in dying on the cross. We have been saved from the dominating power of sin, in that sin's powerful mastery over us is broken. And we don't have to obey it anymore, do we? We have power to say no to what we once could not say no to. And we have been saved to some degree in the present from the very presence of sin, because it no longer is with us at all times and all ways. And someday we'll be saved from its presence altogether, thank God. But though we have been saved and redeemed and forgiven, there is still remaining sin within us. And therein lies the problem. The problem is, if you want to have a pure life and a clear conscience, you have to deal with remaining sin. Does that make sense this morning? The question is, how do you deal with it? This morning we want to use an illustration from the Old Testament, and that's why I had you turn to 1 Samuel 15. I think it may help us and give us a clear picture of how to deal with remaining sin in our lives so that we can have a clear conscience. And instead of having the experience of the psalmist, have the experience of Paul. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15. I know many of you are already there, 1 Samuel 15. This great Old Testament story is meant to teach us of the seriousness of sin and the righteousness of God's holy wrath against it. I don't want to overlook those truths nor the historic value of this, but I would like to use it as a graphic illustration or comparison of how believers have to deal with sin. And that's what we're going for. So let's look at verse 1 in 1 Samuel 15. Samuel also said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over His people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. I'm sure you remember that Saul was chosen because he was head and shoulders above every other man. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He was what the people wanted to be their king. And so the Lord agreed to let them have the man they wanted. He was to be anointed, but there was a caveat, you could say. There was a catch in this. If he was going to step into this role, there was something he had to do, and that was listen to the words of the Lord. He had to hearken unto the Lord. He would bring himself into a position where he was going to be ruling the people of God, and certainly needed to listen to God, who was the true sovereign. And then he gets very specific. Here's what the Lord has to say, and here's what you're listening to. And obey. Verse 2 of 1 Samuel 15. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. That's what's called genocide. He said, I want you to just go wipe out a whole race. A whole tribe in this case. Not really a race, but a whole tribe of people named for the man Amalek. God's command was very clear. Saul was to deal without pity with those Amalekites. He was to kill not only the men, but all the women and all the children and all the babies. And then he was to kill all their animals. And you said, what a message after Thanksgiving. This kind of sounds like, what's that movie? I'm trying to think of the actor right now. Oh, goodness, I shouldn't even have brought a movie up. I was looking at Jack and it came to my mind. Sorry about that, Jack. I had to reflect somewhere. All right. Braveheart. That was kind of a gory movie, wasn't it? But boy, these were gory times. The whole tribe was to be utterly and mercilessly taken out of existence. No hostages were to be taken, and there would be no spoils either. Now the question immediately arises, why would a God of infinite love and mercy and grace just mete out such a severe judgment on a pagan tribe? Well, the Amalekites were an ancient tribe indeed. They were nomadic. That is, they traveled around. And they occupied southern Canaan. They were descendants of Esau, and so they were out of the line of promise. And as Genesis 36:12 indicates, they were the constant enemies of the Jews once the Jews came into the land of Canaan. In fact, you remember when the Jews approached the land of Canaan, initially they were afraid to go into the land. And let me just give you a warning. All this is just introduction for next week. So this is a two-part message, but I just want us to listen closely and really apply this to our lives. And remember them you remember at Kadesh Barnea, and they were hesitant. They didn't want to go into the land. They were fearful because of the frightening savagery of the Amalekites. I mean, it was there that they balked and disobeyed God because they were so intimidated by their fierce, evil, vicious tribe, these Amalekites. I mean, they were horrible people, as President Trump would say. They're just horrible. They were the same tribe who had, as is alluded to here, attacked Israel at Rephidim. In fact, this was shortly after the Exodus, as the text says. And this was the famous battle recorded in Exodus 17 when Aaron and Hur had to hold up, you remember, the arms of Moses so that victory would come or could come. And they had engaged in the war against the Israelites in a very cowardly way. What they did, as we'll read about later, is that they attacked the rear of this mass of humanity that were moving out of Egypt from the Exodus into the Promised Land. They attacked them from the rear, that is, the stragglers. And who would that be? Well, the old people, little children, pregnant women, crippled people, the sick, anybody weak, the weary, the faint. This was truly a coward's way, attacking from the rear. And so they had ambushed Israel, killing all the stragglers and working their way up until finally the battle was engaged. And that is shown to us in Deuteronomy chapter 25, as I'll read in just a moment. It was an expression of their viciousness, their wickedness, their hatred of God. Their hatred of those things which were holy, their savage attitude toward others. And God delivered Israel that day. You remember that story in the holding up of the arms of Moses? The Amalekites fled into hiding. And in the conclusion of the battle, in Exodus 17 and verse 14, God swore to Moses this, "For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." God says, I'll wipe that entire people out. He was so committed to this that he made this vow a part of the Mosaic law. It's in Deuteronomy 25. And all of this is symbolic and meaningful for killing sin in our life. In Deuteronomy 25, listen to these three verses, the last three in chapter 25 of Deuteronomy 25. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way when you were come forth out of Egypt. How he met thee by the way and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee when thou wast faint and weary. And this is what really got him. and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it. And then God added this, thou shalt not forget. This must come to pass. Treacherous, vicious, intimidating, deadly people, the Amalekites, and God's anger burned against them because of their wickedness. According to Numbers chapter 24 and verse 20, God even called on the corrupt prophet Balaam, remember, to prophesy their doom. Judges chapter 6 verses 3 to 5 said that these people like to plunder the Jews. And what they loved to do most of all was to come in and destroy their crops. And that would be to destroy their livelihood and their food supply because they hated God. They detested the Jews. They delighted in violence. They were vicious sinners. Because of all this, and because God had made a vow, God was going to destroy the Amalekites. And when you come down to the text that I pointed out to you in 1 Samuel 15, it's here that it's time for this action to take place, to put the Amalekites once and for all and forever. And so God says, now that Israel has a king, it's time to act. Go now and strike Amalek. Saul and his armies were to be the instruments through which God kept His vow and would carry out this holy execution of an evil tribe. But Saul's obedience was only partial. So let's pick it up in 1 Samuel 15 verse 7. And so Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And this tells us that it was a crushing, widespread, far-reaching, and devastating victory. He slaughtered from pillar to post, from front to back, from east to west, north to south, a crushing defeat. But here comes the problem, verse 8. And he took Agag, we're talking about Saul here and the people of Israel. They took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and of the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, despised and worthless, that they destroyed utterly. They destroyed utterly. We see Saul and the people of Israel, they were motivated by covetousness, motivated by the love of money. They kept all the best animals, they kept all the best possessions, collected the spoils of victory. They didn't even do a thorough job. By the way of executing the Amalekites, a lot of them had escaped. And then worst of all, they spared Agag. They spared the king. Why would Saul be so blatantly disobedient? Well, it wasn't just materialism. In this case, it was pride. Saul was a proud man. Here was a marauding, vicious, terrorizing monarch of this tribe who was known to everybody as the greatest fighter and warrior and victor before whom others just crumbled. Saul was going to show his great mighty power, his great force by holding up the trophy Agag and saying, look what I have. Look what I've done. Look who I've defeated. It was pride and materialism. It was just an evil heart on Saul's part to flatly and blatantly disobey God. But the sin was so serious that God immediately removed Saul and all of his descendants forever from the throne. Look at verse 22. Samuel said in 1 Samuel 15, and Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? You remember that Saul had claimed that he kept some of the animals to offer as sacrifices. That's why he did it, you know. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Can you imagine? Here this king, just freshly made king, and now he's rejected as king. And everybody heard it. And so he was dethroned. Even though he was king, God dethroned him. That's a serious issue. Now look at verse 32. Then said Samuel, bring ye hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Now you've got to know that the people of Amalek who had survived, they were probably somehow in contact with their king. And as long as their king was alive, they felt their people still had a reason to exist. Their king was still alive. They were still intact. And what was happening behind the scene was the surviving members were beginning to be hopeful and revive around the reality that their king had not yet been killed. So then Samuel said, bring ye hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came unto him delicately. And Agag, thinking all is going well, Saul is off the throne. I mean, everybody heard this. Saul is dethroned. Everything is going to be forgiven. Agag comes in cheerfully, and Agag says, surely the bitterness of death is past. It's going to be okay. Well, it's all over. Verse 33, and Samuel said, as thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless, which is another way of saying you're about to die. Among women, and Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. As you think about it, it's a sickening scene, isn't it? It was God who commanded it to be done. And Samuel did it before the Lord, and Samuel was no soldier. Samuel was a priest. But here was God sending out divine judgment from holy wrath against sin. Unlike Saul and the rest of the Israelites, Samuel carried out the Lord's commands. This is a tremendous picture of God's attitude towards sin. Sad to say, the battle that was supposed to exterminate the Amalekites, that was supposed to wipe them out, ended before the goal was ever accomplished. Apparently the soldiers were so busy collecting the spoils and making sure they were sorting out the good animals from the bad that they never really did their job of finishing killing all the soldiers. And Scripture records that a few years later that this invigorated tribe raided the southern territory and took all the women and children captive. So they let them go. They regrouped and grew, and then they done what they started doing over again, what they once did. Look over to chapter 30 of 1 Samuel. Chapter 30 of 1 Samuel. And that's the reason this is a lot of footwork, but we need to get this done so that next week we can be more personal, right? Again, not calling out names, and because I'd have to call my name out, and I don't want to do that. But none of us in here this morning are without sin, are we? We all have things in our life that we need to work on or should be working on. And hopefully we're trying to kill the sin in our lives. And that's what we should be doing. Okay. Chapter 30 of Samuel, verse 1. And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south. And Ziklag and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire. Let me read that again. And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire. And had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. The Amalekites had made a raid on Ziklag. That's in the southern area where they were still hanging around because they were let go. They had overthrown Ziklag, burned it with fire. They took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. And David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's 2 wives had been taken, Ahinoam and the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And that says a whole lot right there for David about the sin remaining in one's life, right? So they come back, and this terrible, terrible marauding bunch of Amalekites had done it to them again. Over in verse 16 of 1 Samuel 30 we read, and when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. And this is the Amalekites, for 1 Samuel 30:17. And David smote them from the twilight even until the evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels and fled. Just about a 24-hour slaughter. And not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. Now some young boys got away, the rest were just massacred. David recorded all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives, and nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. So David had captured all the sheep and the cattle which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, this is David's spoil. David, by God's mercy, rescued those captive women and children and all that spoil from these people, and they disappeared forever after that, gone from human history as God vowed they would be. As I said, this is a very helpful insight into God's attitude towards sinners and His holiness and wrath against sin. But I want to use it just as an analogy, if I might, this morning. It's an excellent analogy, illustration, or comparison of the sin that remains in the believer's life. You know, when you were saved and I was saved, there was at that moment a crushing defeat of sin. A crushing defeat. From one end to the other, from the east to the west, north to south, our sin was crushed. But we still have remaining sin. Sins. There are some Amalekites running around loose in everybody's life. Did you hear that? There are some Amalekites running around loose in everybody's lives. We all have our Agags. And the problem in our Christian lives is not that sin has not been defeated with a crushing defeat. It has, but there is still remaining sin. There are some loose, wicked Amalekites in all of us. And some of us have more Amalekites than others. And though there was a great and glorious and triumphant defeat at the time of our salvation, there is the necessity that the remaining sins be hacked to pieces. Now, when I said some of us have more Amalekites than others, I saw everybody look at, no. Who did you look at? Did you look at anybody instead of yourself? Isn't that how we are? That's a pretty good question, isn't it? Yeah. And though there was a great and glorious and triumphant defeat at the time of our salvation, there is the necessity that the remaining sins be hacked to pieces, or they will revive, they will plunder our hearts, and they'll sap our spiritual strength. We cannot be merciful with the Agags of our life. We cannot be merciful with the remaining sins in our life, or they will turn and create an insurrection and a rebellion and an attempt to destroy us. Well, I'm going to stop here for this morning, and I've got 20-something more pages. So I've got plenty of material for next week. And I know it's been a lot of groundwork this morning, but I want you to see the importance of putting sin to death in our lives, mortifying the deeds of the flesh. And we've got to get to work on that in our lives. We really do. We're letting things just go in our lives, and I'm telling you, it's not going to get better. The more sin that we have in our lives that we know that's there, it doesn't stop with us, it spreads. Other people pick up on it. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Next thing you know, man, you got just sin just flourishing. Then there's sin in the camp, in the church. You have to deal with sin. We have to deal with it. Let's bow for